So the first passage we're going to look at is Revelation 21, 9 through 17. And I have the NIV here. I'm going to read from the NIV. And you guys can follow along in whatever translation you prefer. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb." And he carried me away in the spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and its walls. The city was laid out like a square, as long as it was wide. He measured the city with a rod and found it to be 12,000 stadia in length, and as wide and high as it is long. The angel measured the wall using human measurement, and it was 144 cubits thick. We'll stop there for the time being. So this is, let me say what it's about. Maybe I'll just start there. The subject here is the people of God in all times and places, and they are called the bride, the wife of the Lamb in verse 9. And then the image changes, and the image now is a city, and it's the New Jerusalem. And the thing that you want to keep in mind, the thing that is so hard to keep in mind when we read this portion of Revelation, is that this is a picture, this is an image, and as a picture and an image, it's a symbol. It's a symbol. And what we are looking at when we think about the bride and when we consider the holy city is actually the people of God. Okay, the collective people of God throughout all time and places, all together gathered into one. And let's see.
So that's, you're suggesting that this is in no way to be understood as trying to convey the physical location of the New Jerusalem.
Right. It's, and we're going to run into a problem that some interpreters run into or fall into, I will say, a little bit later on when we talk about these dimensions, but that's still several verses in our future. But yeah, there's a particular, if you think what's being described as an actual place rather than the people of God, then what you end up with is an interpretation about an actual place and not about the people of God. But this is a picture. Mom.
So you're saying that when we get to heaven, there isn't an actual city with brilliant gemstones and stuff like that we're going to get to see?
I guess I'll say it like this, Mom, just so that we can stave off your disappointment, because we know when you get to heaven and it's not what you expected, you're going to be sad.
No, I don't think I'll be sad.
But to stave off your disappointment, the actual precise way to say it is this: I don't know if there are streets of gold. You can't get it from this passage. This passage doesn't tell me actually there's streets of gold in heaven.
Okay.
Etc. There might be, but this passage is not about that. And some people find that to be shocking, but actually, it starts right out. I'll show you the bride, right in verse 9. I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. Now we all understand that the bride is the bride of Christ, the wife of the Lamb, right? The bride of Christ, and that's the people of God, the church. And it's not just the church that exists in one century, but the church throughout all time and place. And we know that. And so he says, "Come, I'll show you the bride." And then he's taken away by the angel to a high mountain. He's taken away in the spirit to this great high mountain. And he's shown the holy city, Jerusalem, or the New Jerusalem. So this is very similar to Revelation chapter 5, where the angel says to John, "Look, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah." And John turns around, and what does he see?
The lamb.
He sees a lamb, right? And what's the conclusion that you draw? Well, the conclusion is that the lamb is the lion. The lion is the lamb. They're both describing the same person. And so what we have here is the image of the people of God as the bride. Come, I'll show you the bride, which John never sees. Doesn't see the bride, not in this chapter at least. But what he does see is the city. So the angel basically says, "I'll show you the bride," takes them over to the city and says, "Look, there's the bride." That kind of thing. So the city is another picture of the people of God. So that's the thing that we want to keep in mind. Now, if you look at Revelation 17, 1 through 3, you'll notice that Revelation 17 is structurally very similar to Revelation 21 that we just read. So 17, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, "Come, I will show you the punishment of the great prostitute who sits by many waters." So it's the same type of introduction. It's one of the angels, the seven angels who have the seven bowls. He says, "Come, I'm going to show you this." And in chapter 21, it's the bride, the wife of the Lamb. In chapter 17, it's the punishment of the prostitute. So it's the prostitute and her punishment. And then verse 2 in chapter 17, with her the kings of the earth committed adultery, and the inhabitants of the earth were intoxicated with the wine of her adulteries. Then the angel carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. So this is repeated in chapter 21. There an angel carried me away in the spirit, but not to the wilderness, to a great high mountain. So it's basically the same format being followed. In chapter 17, again, it continues with, there I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was covered with blasphemous names. It had 7 heads and 10 horns. So he sees the woman on the beast, and he gets an explanation of the woman and the beast as that chapter unfolds. And the point is, in comparing these two chapters, 17 and 21, the point is that you're supposed to pick up that this is a direct comparison or a contrast, and that one image is being held up right next to the other image. And so what you have here is a picture of the people of God as the bride, and that's the New Jerusalem. And that's how it's identified. And then you have the prostitute, who is not the bride. And the conclusion that, at least people in my understanding of how to read the Revelation, see that again as support for the apostate Old Jerusalem is the prostitute, because it's being contrasted with the New Jerusalem, who's the bride. Don.
I've always struggled with trying to understand the reason for the repeated emphasis on the great prostitute and all of that being described as committing sexual immorality. And that seems to be a common theme of sexual immorality or sexual sin, when I've never understood this to really have anything to do with sexual sin as much as it's just idolatry.
Yeah, I think, yeah. Okay, so let me understand your question. You're wondering why the emphasis is on the sexual nature, or the appearance of the emphasis being on the sexual nature of the sin, whereas the actual sin wasn't really sexual. Is that basically the question?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know what the emphasis, the only answer that I have, and I'm not sure if it's satisfactory, maybe somebody else can chime in, but the only answer I have is that sexual sin fits the picture of a prostitute. And So if you're going to describe the prostitute's sin, it's not idolatry, right? That's not typically what you would think a prostitute's sin is. It's sexual sin. And so it fits the picture. And then that picture of sexual sin is already linked in the Old Testament multiple times to spiritual adultery or idolatry. So you have, and then, so basically, I think the answer, at least the explanation that I'm comfortable with for the most part, is that God is speaking to his covenant people in a way that shows continuity with the Old Testament, where he speaks of himself as a husband and them as his wife, or they're the bride, or they're the betrothed to him. And so he's using this metaphor, and it continues into the Revelation, where in the Old Testament, when his people apostatized and pursued idolatry, they were adulterers. They were spiritual adulterers, and they were talked to under the image of a prostitute, and they would get the prostitute's punishment. Is basically what the Lord said to them on several occasions. And so I think that I see it as an image that's just being carried over from the Old Testament and being used again here, because the sin has just continued and it's the same. And even though it doesn't have anything to do with actual physical sexual sin, that sexual sin goes with that image and is linked with it in the Old Testament. So it's not new. It's not new for the people of God to read that or hear that. They would see that and understand it under the images from the Old Testament and how it was interpreted. But so
Seems to be kind of closely relating idolatry to adultery.
Right. Yeah. It's the emphasis is on the unfaithfulness, right? That's the thing that links.
Yeah.
The unfaithfulness to the one you profess to love. That's what links both of those sins. And so one sin is more spiritual than physical, and one sin is more physical than spiritual, although there are physical aspects to both of them and spiritual aspects to both of them. But
and it's also like it represents outside of covenant, marriage, a bride. It's a covenant of marriage, and prostitution is inherently outside of a covenant, other than a monetary exchange. There's no covenant.
Yeah, that's a good point too. So Don, I don't know if I did anything other than just repeat what the passage says. I don't know if I actually addressed your question.
Yeah, I think it gives clarification.
Okay.
Well, one preacher preached one time that the great whore, that's what it says in my book, in my judgment of the great whore, that this great whore represented all the false religions of the world, which is spiritual adultery.
Yeah, and that's an interpretation that is accepted and well used in the Christian church. It depends on what interpretive methodology you're following and how you arrive at that. So on that particular view, it's interesting. That view fits. If you were to just to guess off the top of your head what view that comes from, you would probably conclude that was idealism, because idealism says that these are principles and pictures and things like that. But typically, that's a dispensational interpretation. So that's an illustration of how sometimes the people in one interpretive camp kind of use things from other camps. Another interpretation, so the Protestant reformers all thought that the whore of Babylon was the Roman Church, and that it was Rome that had apostatized and committed spiritual adultery, not the city, but the Roman Catholic Church. And so all of the reformers thought that, and And actually, that was the consistent Protestant interpretation all the way through the 19th century into the 20th century. You know, it's very hard to find. In fact, I would suggest to you, anytime you read an interpretation of the Revelation, make note of what date it was written, and you'll see it's really hard to find. Say John Wesley, for instance, 19th century, he thought that the whore of Babylon was the Roman Catholic Church. That's typical of Protestants all the way through the early part of the 20th century.
I wasn't aware that there was a established entity called the Holy Roman Catholic Church at the end of the first century.
No, there wasn't. Right. So right. So if you think, and I know your point is, and my mom is laughing at it. She understands the point too, right? And Becky, the point is that how could that be the proper interpretation since it was not relevant to the first century audience, right? And I think that's a really legitimate question. However, it presupposes that you think the book was relevant to the first century audience, and that's not what all interpretive groups think. So, shocking as that may seem, historicists don't believe that it's relevant to all of it's relevant to the first century audience, and dispensationalists don't believe that. In fact, dispensationalists don't think it's relevant to most of us right now. Anything after chapter 4, it's not relevant to anybody here because chapter 4 is the rapture and we're all going to be gone. And so historic premillennialists, they think the second coming is in chapter 19, and so the rest of it. So, but the book after chapter 19 is not relevant to us. So anyway, you got different, obviously different ways that people approach the book. And well, it seems like a sound interpretive principle to say this book was meaningful for the people to whom it was written, and delivered. Not everybody takes that and works with it. They have different ways of approaching the book. And I won't spend any more time on it because we talked about that a lot before.
Kind of a non-issue.
Yeah, just by way of reminder, and everybody in the group here, I haven't taken a survey, and I'm not going to take a survey about what your own personal view is. And because as far as I'm concerned, you're allowed to have a different view than me, and that's totally fine, as long as you but the thing that you should strive for is consistency among your own view. So I think the book means what I think it means, but good Christians have disagreed about this. So let's look at back to Revelation 21. So after I just wanted to show what's that word, juxtaposition? The holding up of
Transition.
the two. Yeah, no, not transition, but the comparison of the two things, the prostitute and the bride, and how whatever conclusion you draw from that, they're being treated in the text as on some level, somehow equal. There's some kind of equality between them. There's the bride and there's the prostitute, and one represents the true people of God and the other one the false. And so then you could say, well, it's all false religion, or you could say it's the Roman Catholic Church, or you could say that it's the apostate Jews in the first century, or all the people who persecuted God's people all throughout all the centuries. So that's your different options there. So verse 11 of chapter 21, there's an emphasis in this section that starts here, talking about the city, the holy city Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. Verse 11, it's shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. So the emphasis is on the glory of God. The glory of God is going to come up again in this chapter, at least once, I think twice more. And the thing that makes the city beautiful, right, is not the jewels, and it's not the streets of gold, but it's the resplendent glory, right?
Mhm.
If it's just gold
Mhm.
sitting there and the light's not hitting it, think about it like this: that everything is made out of beautiful materials, but it has no radiance. It's sitting in the shadow,
Right.
right? It doesn't have an internal light, right? But the text says it shines with the glory of God. The glory of God. It's resplendent with the glory of God, and so it is. That's the beauty of the city. That's the thing that beautifies the city. It's the glory of God. And,
Holy
Mhm.
Jesus.
and right. So we want to, you want to keep that in mind, and you want to think about the city is the people of God. And so what is it that makes the people of God beautiful in the world, beautiful in eternity? It's not the people of God. It's the glory of God. God himself makes his people beautiful. So now let's on the outline, I'm kind of moving quickly through here. You'll notice there aren't a lot of other passages and other parts of the Bible we're going to in this section. And that's because in a lot of these places we've talked about, Revelation 21 is repeating things that we've talked about before. So probably we didn't need to talk about them again. So just kind of highlighting things. So we'll talk about the foundation, the gates, and the walls in verse 12 to 14. I'll read these again. Had a great high wall with 12 gates and 12 angels at the gates. On the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, 3 on the north, 3 on the south, 3 on the west. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So we've got 12 gates and 12 foundations, and they have names on them. And so you've got the 12 tribes of Israel on the gates and the 12 apostles of Jesus on the foundations. And the picture basically is this, that it's a picture of the continuity of the people of God and the revelation of God, right? The 12 gates and the 12 foundation contribute to the building of the one city of God, and that the gates. How do you get into the city? Well, through the revelation of God, through the Old Testament people. And what are the foundations of that revelation? Well, the Lamb, as revealed to his apostles and given to his church in the writings of the New Testament. And so there's continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I think this couple of verses here is sufficient, actually, to get rid of dispensationalism as an interpretive method, because in dispensationalism they say the Old Testament is a Jewish book. It was written for Jewish people. It's for the Jews. It's not for the church. And the New Testament is a Christian book. It's for the church, and it's not for the Jews. And there is no continuity. And that the church is a new thing, a parentheses in God's program, not talked about at all in the Old Testament. I think these verses refute that, because they're talking about the continuity between the Old and the New Testament. There's lots of other verses you can go to refute that, but I think this picture just easily does that. Go ahead, Mom. Space bar's not working. Let me ask.
There we go.
There you go. All right.
I've never seen this before as a picture of the church. And it is so glorious.
Mhm.
It shows how beautiful the church is, how firmly established it is, how strong it is through the ages. And it clearly shows the Old Testament and the New Testament as being foundational and integral parts of the church, things that make it strong, and how you're not going to destroy it. It's not going to be destroyed. That's how strong it is. I mean, this whole, these couple of verses are like, wow. I mean,
Yeah.
it just really strikes me as, this is amazing. The church is built upon the work of Jesus and the historical movement of God through the ages.
Mhm. Yeah, and the doctrinal standard is the Old Testament, which is, you know, the revelation of the 12 to the tribes of Israel, which are the gates. So
Yeah.
they're the doctrinal standard, right? And that they are consistent and in full agreement with the message of Jesus as proclaimed by the apostles.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, it's
Yeah.
just, you know, you want to prove the continuity of the scriptures.
Yeah.
But everything,
But
and every,
you
go ahead.
could not build the gates on the wrong kind of foundation. If you're thinking about building a building,
right.
right? I remember that the house to the south of me, when it went up, my contractor built the deck that goes around it. He did not build the house. He didn't want anything to do with the house, but he did not build he built the deck. And one of my neighbors across the street, as this deck is being built, said to me, "Oh, it's going to be terrible. He didn't put the concrete footings down there for the posts." And I said, "Oh, yes, he did. Go take a look." Because had he not put the concrete footings, the posts would rot.
Right.
So you can't build the church on the wrong foundation. The gates will not stand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So it
Well,
obviously,
I'd like to add too, it goes back to God's glory and kind of goes in line too with what James said about how it goes along with the Old and New Testament. Well, first of all, as you said, in the Holy City, the presence of God's glory is the most, I would say, dominant characteristic that we see there, and that it, you know, reveals God's presence with his people. At least that's how I see it.
Mhm.
And then as far as the Old New Testament, I see too where the glory that was departed from the old Jerusalem in the book of Ezekiel is now being restored in the new Jerusalem that we'll be going to in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. Very good observation there. And that also then contains the contrast, right, between the old and the new Jerusalem. And
Yeah.
that's what's being highlighted, I think, with chapter 17 and chapter 21. So
Yeah, it's in Ezekiel somewhere, but I don't know where.
Ezekiel 9, 10, and 11, the glory departs.
Oh, okay.
Right. And then at the very last verse of Ezekiel, chapter 48, 21, the glory returns. But that's a prophetic picture, right? And it says the Lord is there. That's the name of the city. The Lord is there.
Mhm.
And so that's what we're reading about when we read this city, when it says, and God says, I'm there, you know, I'm there with my people. It's the fulfillment of the Ezekiel passage. It's not Ezekiel, you know, the end of Ezekiel is not about some temple that's going to be built. It's about the glorious city. And that's what Revelation 21, 22 is about. You know, it's saying the Lord is there in this city, and there is no temple, right? It's going to say that a little bit later. So there's an interesting detail in verse 12 that probably 60% of the commentators that I looked at, which isn't a lot, I probably looked at 8 or 10, don't even mention it. The detail is there's angels, right? The city had a great high wall with 12 gates and with 12 angels at the gates.
Mhm.
Most commentators skip over that. They don't really know what to do with that. It seemed really obvious to me what's going on, and I was happy to read in one or two commentators that they also had come to the same conclusion. So these are guardian angels, I think. They're not the gates. This is interesting about the gates. Okay, Mom talked about how strong the city is and how unassailable it is, and you can't defeat it. and it will never be broken and taken down. We know from later on in the chapter that these gates are never closed. They're always open. And so it's, you look at the walls and you look at the gates and you think it's for defensive, keep out the enemy, but the gates are always open. So there's no need to do that. But there's angels at the gates, and the angels are reminiscent of the angels in Genesis 3:24, or the angel in 3:24, right? Says after Adam and Eve sinned, God drives them out, and it says, after he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. Well, the tree of life is still in the city. We're going to read that, and but the gates are open, but yet there's still angels at the gates. And the picture is anybody who wants to can come in, right? But some people are still not going to come in, and they're still excluded. But access is open. Access is open, but only those whom God has called will actually go through those doors, go through those gates.
Only those will actually desire to come through the gate.
Right. Exactly. So the other thing about the angels guarding the gates is that in the Old Testament, you had people appointed to this position of guarding the gates, and so now it's that it's still being so you look at the temple or the city, and you think about the city, the New Jerusalem. Well, that's the heavenly Jerusalem. That's the reality. Well, it's a picture of the reality. But on earth, just like the temple, there's the heavenly temple and the earthly temple, and the earthly temple is made after the pattern of the heavenly temple. So you have the same thing with the city. And you have the people who are guarding the gates in the Old Testament are now standing for angels who actually guard the church, who gets in and who doesn't, type of thing. And so the church is supernaturally guarded, is the part of the image there. So the passages in the Old Testament are Isaiah 62:6, and 2 Chronicles 8:14.
The 2 Chronicles 8:14, as his father David had declared Solomon, as his father David had decreed, Solomon appointed the divisions of the priests to do their assigned tasks, the Levitical orders to lead worship and help priests with their daily tasks, and the divisions of the gatekeepers to serve at their assigned gates. This is what David, the man of God, had ordered.
Right. So, and then the Isaiah 62:6, I have posted watchmen on your walls, Jerusalem. They will never be silent day or night. You call on the Lord, give yourselves no rest. So these are watchmen on the walls, not exactly the gatekeepers, but you have the same idea of God. By God's appointment, there's somebody to guard or to watch or to guard the entrance into the city. But it isn't to keep everybody out. It's to just make sure that nothing impure comes in, as we're going to see later in the chapter. But again, a picture. It's a picture of God supernaturally protecting his people and his church.
Doc,
Yeah, Catherine.
if I may, please, briefly, going back to verse 11, where you've read having the glory of God, and you, because I take notes when you speak, and you said the glory of God in verse 11 is God himself. So I'm interested in what you think of this, the word Shekinah, which is spelled Shekinah. And if I can read this quickly to you, and I would like you to help me is this any connection to what you're talking about in verse 11, as far as this is God himself, his glory? Shekinah says, translation of a Hebrew word not found in the Bible, but used in many of the Jewish writings to speak of God's presence. The term means that which dwells and is implied throughout the Bible wherever it refers to God's nearness, either in a person, object, or his glory. It is often used in combination with glory to speak of the presence of God's Shekinah glory. What's your opinion of that?
Yeah, it was hard for me to, I mean, I know I'm familiar with the Shekinah glory. That's what is usually called, or what we usually say about the, when the Israelites left Egypt and they were wandering and there was the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud, that's usually called God's Shekinah glory. And so it's usually associated in a special way with God's presence, usually in a visible way, that there's something visible there. And it's almost, so I think that the term that's actually the harder one to understand in the question is glory, not Shekinah. But and that's because, and so I guess I should explain that. When we think of the glory of God, we usually have a non-specific idea, kind of a general something. It's,
Is it bright? Is it large? Is it all encompassing? Or it can be different things to different people and not be wrong.
Well, yeah, I think though. So when I think actually the glory of God, one of the ways that I found helpful to think about it is that the glory of God is the manifestation of God. In other words, that you see or perceive that God is active, present. You perceive something about him. You see something about him. And so God's glory is not, when God says, I'm going to glorify myself in you, I think what he's
visual.
Well, I think what he's saying is that in some sense of the word see, others will be able to see him in you. In some sense of the word see, which could be intellectually perceive, spiritually grasp, visibly see. And so when it says here that the city was shining with the glory of God, that what that means is that when people look at the city, the people of God, when we in the eternal state look at the church, what we see primarily and maybe exclusively is the beauty of God. We perceive somehow the amazing beauty and worth of God, because that's the thing that is shining off of his people. And that's how we see, right? The light rays bounce off the people and they come into our scene. So that's the picture, is that the glory of God is the manifestation of God in such a way that you perceive it. Might be physical, might be spiritual perception. But and so Shekinah, the Shekinah glory, that's the name that we typically use to associate the visible glory of God during the Exodus events, including the wilderness wanderings and the tabernacle. And then again, it's associated with the tabernacle, and then again with the temple as the special glory that adheres to the presence of God, the presence of God in a special way. And and so, then you get into questions about, well, God is omnipresent, so how can there be a presence of God in a special way? Well, the fact is God has chosen to conceal and reveal himself in certain places and to certain people at certain times in certain ways.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And so So even though God is omnipresent, God is not omniperceived by us.
Oh, okay.
And so, so the Shekinah glory, you can't not miss that. I mean, you cannot
Oh,
miss that, right?
Amen. Right.
Right. So, so the glory of God is all around us all the time. We
Right.
don't have eyes. We don't have eyes to see it most of the time. But in the eternal state, we will not have that limitation. That's a limitation imposed by sin, right? And also, it's also the fact that God doesn't. Luther talked about God often as the hidden God, the hidden God. And God talks about himself as the God who conceals himself, because if you see God, you'll die. And so there's a mediated revelation of God right now. But in the eternal state, we will be in God's presence and not die.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's an incredible thing to think about, and what must be the case, when that occurs. So was that helpful to the question?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, good question. Mike, did you have something to say?
Oh,
Let me check with Mike first. It looked like he was going to say something.
Not particularly. No, I think you covered it and I understood.
Okay. All right. Shirley.
well, I have a question in regards to verse 12, based on some things I've heard about that, and I want your opinion on it. On verse 12, where it talks about the names were written thereof on the 12 tribes of the children of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Now I tell you what I've heard about it, and then you can tell me, you can elaborate and let me know if that's a descriptive, correct explanation of this verse. And what I've heard is that these 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles, they were the foundations of Christianity. And so therefore their names are placed on the foundations of the wall here, of the city. And what that indicates is that both Jewish and Gentile believers will be a part of the family of God and spend eternity as one in the family of God in eternity. And I was just wondering what you thought of that particular teaching.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That, and the only other thing that has to be kept in mind is that, it's a picture. So any discussion about, which list of the 12 tribes, because, you got the list in chapter 7, which is not really the 12 tribes, and you got 29 different lists in the Old Testament. Any discussion about what exactly are the 12 names or of the apostles? Is Paul the 13th apostle? Is he the 12th apostle? How many apostles are there? Those types of discussions, when people start getting into that, they've completely forgotten that this is a picture and that this is the people of God, and that there are no names written on any walls anywhere except in this vision. So, but the point that you made, that the vision unites the revelation of God in the Old and the New Testament, so that the people of God are formed from Jew and Gentile alike and brought into the city. Yeah, that's definitely true. Definitely true. So let's move on to, we'll start talking about the dimensions, verses 15 and 16. I got a couple things to say about that, and got 5 minutes, so I'll try to say something useful in the first 5 minutes. Revelation 21:15, the angel who talked with me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city, its gates and its walls. The city was laid out like a square. What I want you to notice is the dimension, not the dimensions, the shape. I want you to notice the shape. The city was laid out like a square as long as it was wide. He measured the city with a rod and found it to be, NIV translates 12,000 stadia, which is a Roman measurement, which is what the text says. Some Bibles have 1,500 miles or something like that, or something close to that. 12,000 stadia in length and as wide and high as it is long. Verse 17, the angel measured the wall using human measurement. And it was 144 cubits thick. So the first thing I want to say is regarding the shape. The shape of the city is just laid out like a square. So in 2 dimensions, it's a square. Right? But the end of verse 16 says, its length is 12,000 stadia, and it's as wide and high as it is long. Now, you would typically think of a cube at this point, a cube. And I guess before I get into the discussion of the actual shape and what it might signify, I want to say something about the translation of 12,000 stadia and 144 cubits. These numbers, 12,000 and 144 cubits, these are the numbers that are in the Greek text. And when you have a translation that's not using those numbers, they're usually giving you a modern equivalent, 1,500 miles, whatever the yards or feet are for 144 cubits.
Right.
What I want to mention is that the number 12,000 and the number 144 should strike you as probably significant, because 12 is really significant. And we've already come across the 144,000 a couple of times, and we've come across 12 times 12 is 144, and we've come across 1,000, which is 10 cubed, and so we got 10 cubed times 12. This is an important number, right? 144. It's an important number. 12 times 12, and what the numbers connote is completion, perfection, not one missing type of thing. And when you translate them, when you update them to English equivalents, 1,500 miles, the translator shows 2 things. The translator shows, one, he's not sensitive to the way the Revelation uses numbers.
Symbolism.
And 2, he thinks it's literal. Okay. and so I just wanted to point that out.
Oops.
That was lost in the translation.
Yeah.
Whoa.
So that brings me to the main point is that the city is a cube. It is the perfect cube, and it's a picture now. Okay, so I have books up here where people, seriously, half of the commentaries on Revelation, or at least all of the commentaries by dispensationalists on Revelation, try to figure out how many people are going to live in the New Jerusalem and what your real estate is going to be. If it's this big, you can. There's actually a calculator online you can go to and say, I think there'll be 100 billion people in New Jerusalem. How much space will I have in my mansion?
How big is my dorm going to be?
How big's my dorm going to be? So it's like, what do you think that's about? And then there's arguments about the shape. Like J. Vernon McGee thinks it's a pyramid. That is because it's as high as it is wide and all that. So it could be a pyramid, but that it's floating around in space, and so it must be enclosed by glass, a sphere of pure gold that's transparent as glass. So you've got this pyramid encased in this globe of pure gold that's as clear as glass. And J. Vernon McGee actually says, he calls it a planet. A planet. And John Wahlberg tries to figure out how many people are going to live there, and he says you're basically going to have 150 square or cubic miles to each one of us, 150 cubic miles. And I thought, they remind me of C.S. Lewis's picture of hell, where everybody lives really far away from each other because they can't stand each other. And I thought, totally wrong.
And even MacArthur is on board with this understanding.
I know. It was like, well, this is to miss the point entirely, right? This has already been established that this is a picture of the people of God. It's not a picture of their living quarters. So real quick.
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I don't know where they got the figures from, but I've heard that from other sources that the 12,000 furlongs that is actually 2 million square miles.
Yeah,
And like
that's
I
not
said, I
right.
don't know where they got the figures out or how they figured it or whatever, but that's what I've heard. It's 2 million
Would be
square
the-
miles, which is a lot of miles.
Yeah.
That'd be the first question. What's your source?
Yeah. So and that, yeah, that
Yeah,
would be
well, like
incorrect.
I said, I don't know where they got it from. I don't know.
Yeah, it might be true that 12,000 furlongs cubed, because you got length and height and width. That might equal however many millions of miles, square miles you said, but again, that's totally not the point. So it's 12:31. Let me just show you this passage, and then we'll pick up here next week. So 1 Kings 6:20. 1 Kings 6:20. There it is. Talking about the temple. The inner sanctuary the Holy of Holies. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and 20 high. What's the shape? That's a cube. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. Only cube in the Bible, only other cube in the Bible. I think what you're supposed to notice about the New Jerusalem is that it's the Holy of Holies, where God dwells.
The whole city is.
Well,
Yeah.
if you take it down to very, very basic, a cube is the strongest building element that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Any other, if you have a rectangle or a diamond or a trapezoid or a circle, none of those are as strong as a cube.
True.
And so at its very basic, it is the strongest foundation, wall, ceiling that we can have.
Mm-hmm.
There is nothing stronger than that. And so the visual is this is something that will not fail.
Right. Yeah, another indestructible type of image. And
Mhm.
the connection with the Holy of Holies is that the New Jerusalem itself is the place where God dwells. Because God, when we say that God dwelt in the temple, we don't mean that he dwelt in the court. Right? We don't mean he dwelt in the holy place. He dwelt in the Holy of Holies. He dwelt in the innermost part of the court, not court, but the innermost part of the temple. And when the New Jerusalem is described as a cube with dimensions that suggest a cube, if you know that, if you're familiar with the temple, which they would have been, you would go, "Oh, Holy of Holies." That would have been the conclusion.
It's also of significance that in the Old Testament, nobody is allowed in the Holy of Holies except for a priest on one day of the year, I think it was. So this being our dwelling place being in the Holy of Holies is a pretty significant thing.
Yes. Yeah. So, we really need a lot more time to talk about not all the implications, to talk about some of the implications for this. And so we'll do that again next week. But yeah. So look at that. We did 14 verses. Well, actually, we didn't do 14 verses. We did 7 to 15. We did 8 verses. We did 8 verses in an hour and a half. Look at that. Or in an hour.
Boom, an hour.
Record.
Yeah.
Man, anybody's head spinning?
No, it's all good. See how funny you are?
and that was with technical difficulties.
Yeah, it was.
That's right, Becky.
All right.
Oh,
I'm
God
gonna-
bless you.
Yeah, I'm going to end the recording now.